Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel. I hope you're all doing well. This is classic Sophie sitting down and pre-filming, bulk filming several videos in one day in a short space of time. So I am going to be wearing the same outfit again. And even when I haven't been bulk filming recently, I've ended up wearing the same outfits anyway because it's just been sod's law. So we're just rolling with it. I'm having a chill day today, like I think I say in every single video I film, but today is a little bit different. I have been watching and keeping up to date with the most latest season of Between the Covers, which is a TV show that's on BBC Two. You can watch it on BBC iPlayer. It's hosted by Sarah Cox and it's basically a bookish programme all about books. They read, in the latter series, they read two books collectively. There'll be Sarah Cox, the host and the presenter, and then there are four celebrities that come onto the show. They talk about a BYOB, so a bring your own book each. They'll talk about that. There'll be, in the last couple of series they've done, there'll be like a new release book that they all read, and then there'll be a themed sort of like second book that they all read. The most recent series they've done a list of a book from every of the 70 years of kind of like along the lines of the Jubilee theme. So from the last 70 years, books for each year throughout the Commonwealth, which was really, really interesting to see lots of different books on that list. They handpicked a few because obviously they didn't do 70 episodes. So you kind of get this mix of people talking really passionately about the books that they want to talk about, then talking about group picks, and also Sarah Cox does kind of like put in there some fun bookish questions as well throughout the series and between sort of sections, which is really fun. Questions like, you know, what's the last book that made you cry, what's the last book that made you laugh, and various different like sort of funny kind of generic bookish questions, which I quite enjoyed. But it's kind of really got me thinking about if I was on an episode of Between the Covers, what would I take as my BYOB? And it kind of spurred this idea in me to come on and do a kind of like, this would be my segment if I was on Between the Covers, and this would be my like unedited segment talking about my BYOB. Now in true Sophie style, I can't just pick one. I can't pick one. I don't do like favourites. I really struggle to pick favourites. I really, really struggle. And it's something I'm trying to get better at, because this year on my Instagram, I've been doing a best book of 2022. And for each month, I'm choosing my favourite book. And then from the first 2 months, I'm picking my favourite from those two, and vice versa. It's kind of like a book bracket thing. And then by the end of it, you choose your favourite book from the first half of the year, favourite book from the second half of the year, and basically you choose between them and you get your favourite book of the year. So I am trying to get better at it. The thing that I struggle with is that a lot of what I read is really, really different, because these are actually quite, you could argue, quite similar in some respects to quite similar-ish books. But a lot of what I read, I think for the last bracket, I've had to kind of choose from on that challenge. Should I see if I can actually get that up on my so you can see it, so you know what I'm talking about right now? Probably not. So this is what I'm working with, and the last two books I had to choose from was House of Sky and Breath and A Man Called Uva. Now, they're very, very, very different books. And I think that kind of explains it a little bit better than these two. They're very, very different books, but like I say, I'm trying to get better at picking favourites. And even though things are different, still being able to, well, actually this one had more of a lasting impression on me, rather than just saying, well, they're both my favourite, and trying to think a little bit more, not necessarily critically, but just trying to be a little bit more concise with my thoughts of what I've read. So maybe we'll do a whole video about my favourite books of the year when we get to the end of 2022. But this is about my BYOB. So I was kind of sat there like on the sofa. I don't sit on the sofa, I lay on the sofa. And I was kind of like, right, okay, so what would I choose? And the first book that automatically always springs to mind is Outlander by Diana Gabaldon. And I feel like this, I need to do a whole video on the Outlander series and my read of the most recent book, Go Tell the Bees That I'm Gone. I feel like I need to do a whole video on that, but I don't think I have the time to do that right now, because that probably would be like half an hour, 45 minutes of just pure garbage. And I feel like maybe I need to plan that a little bit so it's a little bit more eloquent than just, it would just be like verbal diarrhea, as my mum would say. So this is the book that automatically springs to mind, and when I talk about Outlander and I talk about the series, really and truly I talk about the first 3 books in the series. And like I said, that is a whole other video, a whole other probably series of videos, to be fair. Outlander came to me in 2019, so pre-COVID. We were looking for something to watch on Netflix. When I say we, me and my fiance, he wasn't my fiance at the time, but he is now. We were looking for something to watch on Netflix and Amazon Prime. I had seen the Outlander TV show come up a few times, and I think I'd also seen a couple of people talk about it on BookTube, but nothing major. And I said, well, we can't find what we were looking for. We were looking for Game of Thrones. It wasn't anywhere for free. And I was like, well, why don't we just try this? And then let me try and see if I can locate Game of Thrones. If we don't like this, then we can try something else. Or it gives me a little bit of leeway to try and find Game of Thrones, because I know my cousin has all the DVDs. So I was like, you know, if not, I'll ask to borrow the DVDs from my cousin, which I did do in the end. But cut a long story short, we started watching Outlander. So yes, I am a fake Outlander fan because I found the TV show first, and it's probably the first TV show and only TV show that I have stayed up to the early hours of the morning watching, not fallen asleep with midway through an episode and have to catch up at like 1 a.m. going, oh, should we just watch one more episode? Literally, we just loved it. Absolutely loved it. And the only thing that I was kind of like a little bit hesitant about was knowing the period of history that we were having time travel elements back into. So what is Outlander about? Outlander is about a main character called Claire Randall. Story starts in 1946, post-Second World War. Claire was a combat nurse in the war, and at the time actually had a bit of a sort of like role reversal, because she went off to the front lines in France as a combat nurse, and her husband Frank, he was working with sort of intelligence. We don't really ever quite know what Frank did, but obviously that wasn't Claire's story to tell, but we get the gist that maybe he did a little bit more kind of like intelligence work, but based in London. We don't know if he did any like sort of actual intelligence work like in the field himself, in France or anywhere like that. We don't really know, but it's kind of like you reckon that, like I say, role reversal, he stayed at home and she went off to the front lines to be a combat nurse. So they decide to go to Scotland after the war to basically have a second honeymoon. And Claire has, since the war, had a real kind of new interest and gained this kind of interest in botany and plants and healing powers of plants and various kind of like sort of healing sort of esque things. And her husband, Frank Randall, is really interested in his genealogy. He is actually a historian himself, and goes on to be a history professor. And they go to Scotland. It is where they actually, in the book, initially got married. So they kind of like go back to where they got married for the second honeymoon, and to try and rekindle, you know, their relationship after being apart for the war. And Claire gets transported back to 1740s. She gets transported back to 1743. There's a stone circle. Basically, she goes back to a stone circle that she's already been to, but she goes back because she's looking for a plant, and she can hear these noises. She touches the centre stone in the middle of the stone circle, and she gets transported back, unbeknownst to her. And the person that Frank, her husband, has kind of been doing a lot of historical research about whilst he's been in Scotland, is the first person she comes face to face with, but she doesn't actually know it's him. She thinks it's her husband because they look exactly the same. Very, very striking resemblance. She initially thinks that she's just in the middle of sort of like a historical reenactment, but actually she's in the middle of a English redcoat battalion, basically having a coming together with a Scottish Highland clan, and it's about the Scots kind of like evading the British redcoats and kind of fleeing. This story is just so much more than that as well, and I could gush about it for ages and ages and ages. There's so many different elements to this. Obviously we have the sort of like split timelines. We've got historical, but we've not just got historical from the beginning. We've got then even more the jump back in history. We've got time travel, so we've got sort of like the sci-fi element of time travel. In the later books we kind of also have a sci-fi sort of fantastical element of powers and you know, healing and yeah, it's really, really interesting. But it's also a love story, it's a romance, it's a tug at your heartstrings, and it's a real ride, it's a real journey. And especially this, and like I said, the first 3 books are probably the ones that stick out to me the most and probably my favorites. After that it does get quite military and political and a little bit more sort of slice of life and just kind of like things are just kind of carrying on. Whereas the first 3, there's quite a lot of drama, quite a lot of high stakes. I highly recommend this to anybody. Like I said, the thing that kind of initially was a little bit wary of was the period of history. I have always said that I've enjoyed historical fiction, but I have been very, very, very minute with sort of like the niche of historical fiction I have read, and up until this point was very kind of like war related, and maybe from sort of like the early 1900s onwards, you know, like that was kind of like my niche in historical fiction that I was reading, and I think jumping to 1740s was a big like stepping out of my comfort zone, but actually I really enjoyed it, and it opened up a whole network of a period of history, an era of history, which actually I find really, really interesting. I've gone on to read the Poldark books, which are all down here, which are set, they're a bit later than this, but again in an era of history that I would never have picked up before if it hadn't been for having read Outlander first. And this is just so amazing. And what's also really amazing is when you hear about how the author created Outlander. Diana Gabaldon wrote this as a practice run. I believe she Diana's really was in, I think, sort of like science-based sort of academia, and I think had published scientific work before or been involved in the printing of scientific work before, but this was like her go at trying to write a novel. And she was inspired by a episode of Doctor Who which had a Scottish Highland warrior in it, and then she started writing this but found that actually there was this female character that kind of kept taking over and kept telling the story instead. And then also she felt, hang on a minute, this lady isn't really in keeping with the time period. What on earth am I going to do with that? Oh, don't worry, I'll fix that later. And the way that Diana Gabaldon actually writes is really, really interesting. She writes often a scene. She might be inspired by something as simple as I've watched an interview with her, and she talks about she saw a crystal goblet in some sort of like history magazine book or something like that. She saw this goblet, and she talked about how she kind of like she built a whole scene around this sort of like image that she saw of this crystal goblet in whatever specific publication she saw it in. And it was really, really interesting. She writes very sort of like scenes and then dotted sort of all over the place, and then she has to play this whole sort of like stitching, weaving game of kind of like getting it all seamless and all together, and has to write the interludes to kind of make everything make sense and have like a timeline. So for that, I think it's actually a real big like masterpiece as well. And I do feel like you can see that more in the later books as well that she writes it a little bit more sort of haphazardly than maybe someone that sits and writes beginning, middle and end, or has a little bit more of a sort of like knows where it's going to go, because I don't know if Diana really knows where it's going to go, and she often talks very much about how she's kind of led by the characters, and so that's why I love Outlander. I found it massively gripping, massively dark, massively traumatic, but massively amazing as well. And I definitely think it shaped me. That's a really cliche thing to say, isn't it? I think it shaped me. I think it shaped my reading, and it really broadened my reading sort of like horizons as well when I read this, because like I say, an era of history that I'd always disregarded and always thought, no, I'll find that too boring. Actually, no, it's really interesting, really interesting. And it kind of also kickstarted a sort of like reignited my love of history again. I've always enjoyed history, but growing up at school and at like secondary school, history was always very much what you had on the syllabus, if you know what I mean. It was like, this is what you have to learn about, not necessarily things again that you're interested in or find as much interest in, but this kind of really reignited my love of history as well, and got me kind of doing my own research and looking into my own sort of like, oh, I want to know a little bit more about that. Or and this has also led me on to reading a couple of other books and series as well, which are really interesting. The Into the Wilderness series by Sarah Donati, which are here. You know, they talk a lot in one of those books about the smallpox vaccination and the development of that. And it's just really interesting. And there's so much. I mean, they're big. They're like, it's a, you know, commitment, but in my opinion, so worth it. And I have read the majority of the series now twice, almost the whole series twice. But I can't talk about my BYOB, my favourite book. I don't think it's fair to talk about that without then actually talking about Wuthering Heights as well by Emily Bronte. This is a story that I have completely grown up around. My mum loves the story of Wuthering Heights, and in the 90s actually went and saw a musical version which is actually called Heathcliff, and that starred Cliff Richard, and it was kind of like his baby. My mum's a massive Cliff Richard fan, by the way, and there's something about that I was just, she had the VHS for the musical that was like put on. I frequently put that on as a child, and when I was then old enough to read it, I read it. My original copy is actually my mum's copy, but I bought this gorgeous copy to match Ill Will by Michael Stewart, which is the missing years of Heathcliff. He's kind of like written his own, like, what do we think Heathcliff did in the missing years of this book. So what is this? Again, this is a very troubled story. This is kind of like star-crossed lovers that kind of never get what they deserve. Well, you could kind of argue they do, but they never get their time together, and that's probably a bit of a spoiler, but it's a classic. I don't feel too bad spoiling classics because they've been around for so long. If you haven't read it by now, are you going to read it? This is basically the story of a house in the Yorkshire Moors called Wuthering Heights. It is house to the Earnshaw family, and one day the father comes home with a orphan gypsy boy, which they name Heathcliff. The man already has two children, Hindley and Kathy. And basically when the father subsequently dies, Heathcliff is kind of like pushed to the sideline. He's raised initially as like one of them and one of the children, and there are talks about whether he actually was the bastard child of Mr. Earnshaw. We kind of never really know that, and it's never really kind of like touched on completely. There was a high possibility that it could have been, but we get this story of how he kind of gets pushed to the sidelines. He's kind of degraded to be a servant, and then the social kind of like commitments that some of the characters then have to make in order to kind of fit in society and their expectations in society. But what's really interesting about this is the way that it's told. So you start the story with a character called, oh, I can never remember his name, Mr. Lockwood, I think. He is new to the area. He's renting a house from Heathcliff, and he comes to Wuthering Heights to see the guy that he's renting the house off of, and unfortunately gets caught there in a storm. He has some really, really strange occurrences, very gothic stuff happens because he can't get himself home, and it then leads one of the servants, Nellie, to kind of tell the whole story of the two houses, Wuthering Heights and Thrushcross Grange, and everything like that. It's a really, really interesting way of being told, and obviously there's kind of like elements there of, you know, can you believe everything you hear? But then it's a really, really special story to me, and like I say, it's really, really a story that I have grown up around. I was watching movie kind of adaptations from a very young age, and then like I said, when I was actually competent enough to be able to read it, because it is an old text and there is a lot of kind of difficult sort of language used, because it is thick, you know, like Yorkshire language, like sayings, and the way that they kind of speak is put on the page, if that makes sense. So if a character was saying, like, I've got to try and find an example. I don't know if I could find an example, like rather than saying Mr, it says Meister, because that's kind of like in their accent the way they would have said it. Does that make sense? So once I was able to read it and fully comprehend it, I read it, and this will be a book that I continue to read time and time again. And I feel like Outlander, each time you read these, you'll have different experiences and they'll mean different things to you at different stages in your life. And I think a book that kind of can survive kind of like the test of time with you as an individual is a really, really important book. Something like this that will hit you differently at each point of your life. I know this sounds really silly, but like now, being the age I'm at and getting married and stuff like that, I'm sure reading this would kind of hit me differently in kind of that way. You know, if you were to then become a mum, I think reading this would then hit you in a very different way as well. And kind of like all those like life kind of, not that that's what you have to do and that's not what the goal of life is, but I think like at each different stage in your life, these sorts of things will hit home differently. And I think that's probably a very similar story with both books, that they are just very, very hard hitting and very like, you'll appreciate different aspects of it, if that makes sense. So these would be the two books that I'd choose from for my BYOBs if I was to go on between the covers. I actually think that BBC One, BBC Two or whatever, BBC should add a general public seat to the mix in the panel of guests that they have. I think it would be really interesting to see you know, just some non-celebrity people come on, non-celebrity guests, and bring their own books as well. I think it'd be really, really interesting mix. But there's been some amazing books from the show that I have added to my wish list and subsequently added to my TBR. Some books that I can't wait to read, some books that I've read and then really loved watching the sections because I'm like, oh yeah, I love that as well. So it's a really, really good series to watch if you haven't watched it already. And if there's any bookish TV programmes that you've watched and you've really enjoyed, please let me know, because I've watched it all now and I've got to wait for the next season, which I think is due to come in the autumn time, I think. But yes, I'd love to hear if you've got any other recommendations. And yeah, what would be your BYOB? Have you had a think about that? If you have, let me know down below in the comments. But I hope you enjoyed this video and I'll see you on the next one. Bye!